Hi guys, I'm doing a book review today on Kristin Hannah's The Nightingale, a historical novel going through the Nazi occupation of France in World War II. It covers the story of two women who are sisters and their journeys through this horrendous time and the kind of things that they had to go through. If you're not one for historical novels or perhaps even a little bit of violence, then this book is probably not for you. There is a lot of times in this book where you are made to feel all sorts of emotions, and in some times you're not even sure what to feel. If you've read Kristin Hannah's work before, she does cover a lot of hard topics in terms of violence or abuse, so there are common themes in this novel that highlights that as well, which can make some readers uncomfortable. I think that this novel also presents something that we don't often talk about, and that is the women's side of the story of the war and the kinds of things that they went through and had to deal with, and I think that's a really important value in this book. So the first line in this book is, "In love we find out who we want to be, and in war we find out who we are." I think that is the perfect line to set the scene of this entire novel, because that's exactly what these characters do and how they discover who they are and the kinds of values that they hold that maybe they didn't think that they held in the first place. I just also want to highlight the blurb in this book because I think it's really important. So Kristin Hannah says, "This is a story about what it's like to be a woman during the war, when women's stories are all too forgotten or overlooked." So we hear a lot about the men in the trenches and what they had to do to fight for the freedom and fight for the sanctity of their country, but we don't often hear about what the women go through, and in this book it's actually in their own home. It's also a line that you think about from the beginning to the end, because even though it's on the first page, by the end of it you're met with it again, and you can see exactly why. It's in war that these characters find out who they really are and what they would do to put everything on the line and risk their own lives for those around them and who they care about and who they love, and even at times what they would do to save strangers. And you're met with characters that go beyond their limits to do things for people, even when you think that they didn't have kindness within them, and those emotions can be confusing in this book. I just want to let you know that this book review won't have any spoilers, but we do go into a little bit of depth of the characters and the personalities that you face and what you can generally expect from Kristin Hannah's work. So like I said, this is a novel about Nazi occupation in World War II in France. For me growing up, this is not something I really learnt about in school, so the topic is actually completely new to me. I do know the general basics of what happened in World War II, but the France side of it I've never read anything about, so this was new ground for me. And then add in the fact that it's about the women's stories, and this is something that is really crucially important that I think a lot of people need to read up on, because I wouldn't have known about what these women had gone through. And even though the book is not fact, it is based on real life stories. Kristin Hannah went through really deep research to get this book together, and so the accounts are pretty accurate for the most part, and for a lot of it you forget that you're actually reading a work of fiction. So the storyline follows two sisters who are complete opposites. You've got Vianne, the older sister, who is shy and doesn't want to bring attention to anything that they're doing, especially during this time and the turbulence. And then there's Isabel, the younger sister, who's the rebellious kind and wants to make a difference in the war. And she is also that kind of personality, if you've ever seen Game of Thrones. She's like Arya. So she wants to go out and fight the battle for herself. She doesn't want to sit back and watch everyone else around her die, especially those she cares about, and she doesn't want to be the woman left back in the house. There's something that drives these characters to put everything on the line, and then you're sort of left with the question of, would you do the same thing if you were in this situation? And I think it's hard for us to relate these days because we've never really had such a circumstance around a lot of us, at least not in my community and my upbringing. So it is quite jarring when you think about the fact that this could have happened to you in another time. These two women have their homes invaded and they're forced to live with the Nazi officer Captain Beck, and it's in his own personality that the reader is confronted with some pretty jarring emotions. You're not sure how to feel about Beck and Vianne's relationship and their household that they have to live in together, but also the fact that Beck's not all of a bad person. He's a person that's stuck in a bad situation, and the emotions you get as a reader for feeling sorry for him can also leave you feeling a little bit guilty. So I just want to point out again that these two personalities of the sisters are polar opposites. Vianne wants to play the bright and safe field and not bring any attention to the household, especially because she has a daughter, Sophie, to take care of while her husband is out in war. And then there's Isabel, who's forced to stay with Vianne, and she doesn't want to sit by and let the world just go to waste in a battle that she can't fight. So she does want to go and find a way to help in her own way, and that draws some attention, especially from the likes of Beck, who is living with them, and remember, he's a Nazi. So this is a real risk for the two sisters, and they have to battle their egos and their relationship at the same time. Believe me that when you read this book, these are the kind of characters that will stick with you forever. You don't even realize that they're not real by the end of it, and I have read this book probably 3 months ago, and I still think about them almost every day. One, because I feel like some of their traits are also in me, and also two, because I just can't fathom the fact that they went through this. Real women went through these struggles, and it's just heartbreaking to know that that happened. Beyond everything else that also happened in World War II, obviously, but the women's side of it we often don't hear about. So these two women are obviously living with a Nazi and struggling with that as it is. And then add the fact that they've already had quite a difficult childhood growing up. So their mother died when they were younger, and their father really struggled from coming back from the Great War and just didn't know how to be a father after that. And unfortunately that didn't work out, and the girls were shipped off to live in a home. So following from that, Vianne gets pregnant at an extremely young age. She has a baby out of wedlock, and that's obviously doesn't go down too well. So then Vianne struggles to be able to raise her sister as well. She's generally not dealing all too well with life and being abandoned by her father, and now Isabel is on her hands as well as a newborn. And even though she has her husband, Vianne really struggles. She's not that confident type. Isabel ends up in another home, in a girls' school, and time after time she is expelled. So that, you can see, is really where Isabel's rebellious personality can start to build, because she's gone through being handed through one family to another, to another, to another, and suddenly she's this really defiant and confident personality that doesn't want to stand for crap, honestly. So that's how those two characters are built, and it comes back to full circle when Isabel's expelled for the last time right before the war really kicks off, World War II that is, and she goes back to live with her father, who just doesn't, I guess, want her, and you really painted a picture of him being not all that pleasant. Isabel is forced to go back and live with Vianne, and that's exactly where Antoine is sent off to war. Captain Beck comes to live with them, and the story kicks off. So Antoine ends up becoming a prisoner of war, and Vianne learns this through Captain Beck, who is able to help her communicate with her husband while they're apart. So again, that's that whole situation of Beck not being all of a bad person, even though he's put in a bad situation. And don't get me wrong, he does do bad things, and obviously this is a Nazi that we're talking about, and we have to remember that, but it's not all black and white, and things aren't as simple as, you know, being good and bad. The other important figure in this story is the father, and like I said, he's not painted in the best of light at the beginning of the book, but you learn why, and throughout that he really redeems himself, and by the end of it you're just left with this melting feeling in your heart that, you know, he really did redeem himself. He got what he wanted. He proved himself to his daughters that he isn't a bad father at all. Kristin Hannah also paints these characters as being quite complex. They don't want to go down without a fight, and obviously they're very proud of their heritage and their French community, and these are communities in a small town that band together and will fight for what it takes for their rights, so they're not going to go down without a fight, and Isabel is really the beacon of that. And just pointing it out there, this isn't a spoiler because you kind of met with her in the first chapter, but that's exactly how she becomes the Nightingale. I'm not going to tell you who is the character at the beginning of this story and who is actually telling it from her perspective and from the past, and how it flashes back and forth, and ultimately in the present she is faced with death and coming to, you know, an older age. So that is a huge twist in the book, and when you find out who it is, and it kept me second guessing throughout the whole novel. You obviously know that it's one of the sisters, but you can't quite pin which one, so keep an eye on that because that's a super interesting part. So Isabel decides she wants to go off and aid the war. She can't sit back any longer, especially in Vianne's house when they're not getting along and there's a Nazi under the roof. Vianne just wants everything to be safe and not to put her daughter Sophie at risk, while Isabel's really struggling to live with the Nazi for obvious reasons. So she goes off to find her own way to battle. She obviously wants to head into the fight and do it herself, but that's not exactly possible. So the way that she finds her way into the war and to fight a battle is really interesting, and that's exactly how she becomes the Nightingale. Isabel finds the love of her life, Gaten, throughout the story, and that is probably one of the biggest factors. By the end of it, you just feel a huge sense of love, and like any kind of story like this, you're gonna have a romance, and that is where you find it in Isabel, who's this really stubborn personality, and also in Gaten, and hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, but Gaten is also exactly the same as her, and they're both stubborn, and that's why they work. I think that's the biggest part of this book that I like the most. Kristin Hannah always shocks me. It doesn't matter what she writes about. You think you know what's going on, and then it twists the other way, and that's what you want in a book. We're not taught about the women's side of war enough, and I think it's really important to read this book whether you are an avid reader or you're not, or you don't like historical fiction or you love it. This is really important. These women went through horrific things, but also they don't get remembered for it enough. For me, that's also the biggest thing about The Nightingale. It's about gratefulness and it's about perception. In 2020, we've obviously lived through some pretty tough circumstances with the pandemic, and I'm in Melbourne, Australia, where it's been especially bad. So when I read this book, it gave me a sense of perception that things could really be a whole lot worse. We're going through a tough time here in 2020. We all know that. But you pick up this book and you remember that history has gone through far, far worse, and the stories that have gone on, we just can't sort of fathom still. So if you're looking for a sense of a reality check or a sense of perception, this is also a great book for that. It really redeems the factor that, you know, you do live in a pretty lucky time, and pandemic or not, there have been moments in history that have been far worse. All in all, I give this novel a 5 out of 5. It's going to be that novel that sticks with me forever. I don't think I'm ever going to forget this, and it's probably one that I'll end up recommending to all of my friends and family to read, even though I know they won't. But it is a really important story, and I think that society really needs to pick up around that. But there's just so much in this story that you can't not love, and the complexity of it and the depth of the characters, and then, you know, the fact that once you finish the last page, you have to remember that this was fiction, even though the accounts are pretty accurate and real, and the research she's done is so complex. But it's just one of those stories that's going to stick with you forever. So if you like historical fiction, or even if you don't, pick up Kristin Hannah's The Nightingale, because this is one that's going to linger with you for a while. And there are so many quotes and so many moments in this book that they get embedded in your heart. So I definitely recommend this. Add this to your TBR list and let me know how you go and whether you liked it.